htmx is a type of HTML over the wire framework for building modern user interfaces with the simplicity and power of hypertext. It gives you access to AJAX, CSS transitions, WebSockets, and server-sent events directly in HTML using HTML attributes. With htmx, you get to use little or no JavaScript, which means you don't have to reach for JavaScript frameworks like Vue or React to build modern user interfaces. In this mini course, you will learn how to get started with AdonisJS and htmx. We will be building a simple to-do app. Simple but enough to help us get started with using htmx with AdonisJS. We will cover things like creating to-dos, marking to-dos as completed, and deleting to-dos. Along the line, you will learn cool stuff about AdonisJS and htmx. So come along as we get started in the next lesson. To keep this course focused on htmx, I have gone ahead to flesh out an AdonisJS application, which contains just one page, which is the page that you are seeing, and it contains two sessions. The first session contains an input field for adding to-dos, while the second session is where we are displaying a list of to-dos. For now, the form doesn't do anything, and this is just a dummy text. And if you take a look at the code, this is the form for creating to-dos, and this is where we are displaying the to-dos. As you can see, for now, they're just markup with no functionality. Also, I have gone ahead to create the necessary routes. So we have the home route, which displays the page that we just saw. And also we have another route to create a to-do, and another route to mark a to-do as completed. Then lastly, a route to delete a to-do. Also, I have stopped out the methods. Now that we are up to speed, let's move on to integrating htmx in this application. And we are going to start with installing htmx. There are a couple of ways to install htmx, as you can see from the documentation. But in our case, we'll be installing it via npm, since our application already has encore configured. So I'm going to grab this. Once that is done installing, next we'll import it inside the app.js file. Import htmx from htmx.org. So this will import htmx, but it is recommended to add htmx to the window so that it is easily accessible, and which is what we are going to do. So window htmx equals htmx. I'm going to save this, and you notice that the compiler has picked it up and compiled it. So that is all we have to do to install htmx in an AdonisJS application. In the next lesson, we will start making use of it. Now, let's add the first functionality to the application, which is adding to-dos. But before we get to that, let's get rid of the dummy data we currently have. I'm going to start by updating the index method. So instead of just returning a view, I'm going to fetch the tags from the database. Const tasks equals await task.all. Then I'll pass the tags to the view. Then in the view, we can loop through the tasks. So each task in tasks, then end each. Also, I'm going to have a fallback for when no tasks have been created. So else, then inside it, we are going to have a role that will comprise of just one column. Then I'm going to set the column to span 3 columns. Then I'll add some classes. First, we're going to align the text to the center. Then we'll set the text size to be small. Then lastly, the text color to gray 500. Then the content will be no tasks. Next, we need to update this also. Here we'll display the to-do, which is task title. Let's check it out in the browser. Just as we expected, we've not created any task. Now let's make the form to add to-dos functional. We will be using htmx to undo the form instead of the traditional way, which will refresh the page once the form is submitted, which is not what we want. But what we want is to submit the form via AJAX, which will ensure that the form is not refreshed, so that we can have that spa kind of feeling. Remember I said earlier, we can easily make AJAX requests with htmx by simply using HTML attributes. If we head over to the documentation, and on the AJAX session, we have different attributes to make different AJAX requests. In this lesson, we want to make a post request. So we'll be making use of the hx post attributes. So let's update the form. hx post. This takes the URL or the endpoint we want to make the request to. And in our case, it's going to be /tasks. Remember, I've already defined the route. So this is the route we are making the request to. Next, let's update the store method. First, let's pull in request and view from the context. Then we can do await task create. Then we specify the title, which will be from the form. You notice that I've given the input field a name of title. So we can do request input, then title. Then we can save the newly created task in a variable. Unlike JavaScript frameworks like Vue and React that expect an endpoint to return JSON, htmx expects an endpoint to return HTML, hence the phrase HTML over the wire. So we need a way to return an HTML after the task have been created. And we can't just do response redirect back because that will return the full HTML, which is not what we need, and which is where HTML fragment comes in. HTML fragment, as its name implies, is just a fragment or a section of an HTML. And AdonisJS can easily return HTML fragments. Then this will be the content we want to return from the endpoint. For example, let's say we want to return a paragraph. Say task created. This is just an example, but in our case, we don't just want to send some kind of text indicating that the task was created, but instead we want to show that the task was indeed created. So what I mean by that is that once we create a to-do, we want it to be listed here automatically. So which means that what we will return here will be a role from the table. So this is what we want to return from that endpoint. And we can either construct this by hand, that is, we do something like this and update the dynamic part. Mere looking at this, I don't think it's something that we want to do. So the other option is to make use of edge partials. So I'm going to move this inside a partial. Let me create a partial. It's going to be inside a partials directory. And the name of the file is going to be task.edge. So now I can paste the content in. Let me reformat. Then inside here, I can make use of the partial. Include. The partial is inside a tasks directory and a partials directory, then the name of the partial, which is task. If I head back to the browser and refresh, everything should still work as before because we are basically still doing the same thing, just that I have extracted that piece of code into a dedicated file. So now in the store method, instead of doing this, we can render the partial, that is view render, then the partial which is inside the task directory, then the partials directory, then task. Then lastly, we need to pass the task, because if you take a look at the partial, we are making use of the task there. So that is all we need to do on the backend side of things. Just to recap, we persist the to-do into the database, then we return an HTML fragment containing the task that we just created. Let's head over to the browser. I'm going to try creating a to-do. First, let me open the network tab. So let's create a to-do. We are getting an error 403 forbidden, and if you take a look at the response, so this is because the CSRF token is missing from the form. There are two ways we can go about resolving that. So the first way is the way that we are already used to, which is simply adding the CSRF token field to the form. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at the second method. So let's head back to the browser and try creating the to-do again. The request is successful, and if you take a look at the response that we got back an HTML, and if I view the raw HTML, it is a fragment, which is the partial we created. I will notice that the title of the to-do has been swapped in, which is what we want, which means we are good on the back-end side of things. But if we move our focus back to the page, you notice that the to-do has replaced the input field, which is not what we want. By default, htmx will insert the response gotten from the endpoint inside the element that triggers the request, which is this. And if I head back to the browser and inspect this, you notice that the input field was replaced with the response from the endpoint, which is not what we want. We can specify that we want the content to be inserted in a different element by making use of yet another attribute, which is hx target. This takes a CSS selector. Remember, we want the task to be displayed inside here, inside the table. So the target is going to be this table. So I'm going to give it an ID of task list so that I can point the target to it. So yeah, we're going to specify the ID we just created, which is task list. Let's head back to the browser. I'm going to create another to-do. Now the to-do is added in the correct place, but still not what we want because it is overriding the existing to-do, which is the default behavior of swapping. By the way, swapping is a term htmx uses for inserting a response into a target. But we don't want this default behavior of replacing the existing content. And if you take a look at the documentation on swapping, we have different options we can choose from. This is the default, which is it will put the content inside the target element, which is not what we want. But what we want is the after end, which appends the content after the target in the target parent element. So for that, we'll make use of another attribute, which is hxSwap. Then the swap behavior we want is after end. Let's try it out one more time. So this is what we want. The new to-do is appended to the end of the list. Our to-do app is taking shape, but you'll notice that the input field is not being cleared after creating the to-do. We can fix this by listening to htmx events and clearing the field after a certain event has occurred. So if you take a look at the documentation one more time and head over to the event session, let me go to the reference. These are a list of events that htmx will fire at specific points in time. So we have abort, after onload, after process node, and the likes. And the one we're interested in is after onload, which is triggered after an AJAX request has completed processing a successful response. So let's head back to VS Code and make use of another attribute, hxOn. So the hxOn attribute is used to listen to htmx events, and the events I want to listen to is the htmx after onload. And what we want to do is clear the input field. From the after onload event, we have access to the event that is fired, and we can get the target from the event. Target here will be this form that comprises of the input field and the button. And what we are interested in is the input field, which we gave the name of title. So we can target that input field using the title. Then we can set the value to an empty string. Let's head over to the browser and create another to-do. And just as we expect, the to-do has been created and is being displayed in the correct way, and the input field has also been cleared. And with this, we can wrap up this lesson and take it further in the next lesson. There's a small bug in our application, which has to do with the way we are displaying the to-dos. From the database, we are displaying the latest to-dos first, but upon creating a new to-do, we are appending the new to-dos to the bottom of the list, which is kind of contradicting, and you will notice it once you refresh the page, which loads the to-dos from the database. To resolve that, we can either update the database query to order by in a particular direction to fit what we want, or to update the swap method we are using. Also, we are using the wrong swap method, that is the after end, which will append the content after the target in the target parent element. What do I mean? So let's create another to-do. If you inspect the newly created to-do, you notice that it is outside the target, which is the table body, and which is not what we want. We want it to be inside the target as a child element of the target. To resolve the two issues pointed out, we are going to make use of a different method. So instead of using after end, we are going to use after begin, which will prepend the content before the first child inside the target, and that is what we want. So let's create another to-do. Now the task is added to the top, and if we inspect it, it is inside the table body and it is the first child of the element, which is exactly what we want. And if we refresh the page, the order remains the same. Next, let's move on to marking a to-do as completed. That will be done inside the partial, which contains the checkbox to mark a task as completed. If we take a look at the route one more time, the route to mark a to-do as completed is a patch route. So we need to make a patch request, and we can do that using the hxPatch attribute. Then we need to specify the endpoint to send the request to, which is going to be /task/ the ID of the task we want to mark as completed. Then also we need to specify a target. Remember, by default, htmx will use the element that triggers the request as the target, which is this, and that is not what we want. So the target in this case is going to be the whole role. And since we are going to have multiple roles representing each to-do, so we need a way to uniquely identify each role. And we can do that by giving each role an ID and appending the ID of each task to the name, then the ID of the task. So the first role is going to be task 1, then the next task 2, and so on. I'm going to move this inside a variable because I know I'll be reusing it, and I can easily set a variable using the set tag. I'm going to call it task ID, and the value is going to be this. So now I can use the task ID here. So if I save and refresh, and if we inspect each role, you see that they now have a unique ID. Next, we are going to set the target to the ID. Then we will also specify the swap method to be outer HTML, which will replace the entire target with the returned content. Next, we are going to check the checkbox if a task has been completed. So we are going to have a ternary operator. If a task is completed, the checkbox is going to be checked. Otherwise, it's not going to be checked. Then lastly, we need to update the title also to be striked out once it is marked as completed. First, let me wrap this in a div. Then I'll add a class. Again, I'm going to make use of a ternary operator. So if the task has been completed, then we are going to add a class of line true. Otherwise, we won't add any class. Let's see how this looks in the browser. No difference yet because we haven't marked any task as completed. Now let's move on to the backend side of things. First, I'm going to pull in params, request, and view from the context. Then first, we need to get the task that we want to mark as completed. Await task, find or fail. Then we'll pass in the ID of the task, which we will get from params. Then we can mark the task as completed by setting is completed to the value of the checkbox. So that is request input. Remember, we gave the input field a name of completed. So we'll use that here. Because by default, this will return a string. That is why we are casting it to a boolean. Then we can persist the change to the database. Then lastly, we need to return a view. So just as we did in the store method, we're also going to return the task partial. Now, task here is going to be the completed task. Let's write in the browser. Let's say we want to mark this task as completed. It doesn't seem to do anything. Let me open the network tab and retry. So we are getting that error we got earlier, which is invalid CSRF token exception. In the lesson where we are creating to-dos, I showed you one way to resolve this, and I mentioned that there are two ways. So in this lesson, I will show you the other way to resolve this issue. The other way is to make use of htmx events. If you take a look at the event documentation again, amongst the list of events that htmx fires, there's a config request event, which is the one we are interested in. And this event is triggered before the request, and which allows us to customize parameters and headers. So what we want to do is, before sending a request, we want to set a particular header, which is the X CSRF token header, which AdonisJS expects. So that way we don't need to add the CSRF token field to a form. Let's head over to VS Code and implement that. I'm going to do that inside the layout file. Just before closing of the body tag, I'm going to add a script. Then I'll add an event listener. And the event that we want to listen for is the htmx config request event. Then we're going to specify a callback, which takes the event that is fired. Then we can use the event. Then we want to set the headers. And the header we want to set is XCSRF token header. And we're going to set the value to be the CSRF token. And we can get that using the CSRF token global. And this needs to be a string. If we head back and refresh, before sending the request, let's inspect the HTML. So this is the script we just added. And this is where we are setting the XCSRF token header to contain the CSRF token. Now let's mark this task as completed, and everything should work as expected. As you can see, we got a successful response. And because the task has been marked as completed, the checkbox remained checked and the task has been striked out. Of course, we can mark it as incompleted. To wrap up this lesson, since we now have a way to automatically add the CSRF token, we don't need this anymore. So we can get rid of that and everything should still work as before. To wrap up this course, let's add a way to delete a task. Remember, the route to delete a task is a delete route. So we need to make a delete request, and we can do that using hx delete attribute. And the endpoint is going to be similar to this. So I'm going to grab it. The target is also going to be the same thing with this. So again, I'm going to grab it. Then lastly, we can specify the swap techniques we want to use. And in this case, it's going to be delete, which will simply delete the target, that is this whole role. Next, let's update the destroy method. I'm going to pull in params. Then just like marking a task as completed, we're going to get the task we want to delete. Then we can simply delete the task. Since we're deleting a record from the database and we're not displaying anything on the page, we don't need to return HTML here. So if we head to the browser and try this, so let's delete this task. As you can see, that task has been deleted. So that brings us to the end of the Getting Started with AdonisJS and htmx course. I hope you found this course useful, and I hope this course has enlightened you that you don't necessarily need to reach out to front-end frameworks like Vue, React, and the likes to build modern user interfaces. You can use frameworks like htmx to have that spa feeling with the simplicity of server-side rendered applications. Lastly, let me know if you would like to see more of htmx content.